Suffolk County. From the coast to the fields and forests, it is unexpectedly one of the most environmentally progressive counties in the nation. But it wasn't always this way, and still faces problems today.
If you think about Long Island, it is a microcosm of the United States. So what's happening kind of across America was definitely happening here on Long Island. It was post-World War II. We had massive suburban expansion going on.
A city that moves is a city that grows. As the LIE marched east, people were doing longer and longer commutes. There was higher demand for the land. Farmland was being gobbled up at a rate unprecedented as suburbanization spread.
No mountains, no rivers, no physical boundaries to prevent the impending urban sprawl. What immovable object did this unstoppable force meet? Not what, but who? Dr. Lee Koppelman. Dr. Koppelman grew up in Astoria, Queens, where he was influenced by his architect father and the culture of his populated surroundings.
And if you think about the 1950s, this is not only the age of the baby boom, but it's also our economy rising, and it's people recovering from having gone through the Great Depression and then going through World War II. Now it's about comfort. It's about finding home and going, this is, where we are, and not necessarily thinking about the long-term impacts.
Early 70s, there were no wetlands laws. EPA was only established for a year or two in the federal government. The SEQRA process was in its infancy. And at that time, too, local governments and the planning functions of local governments weren't as sophisticated as they are today. So, at that time, the planning decisions, a lot of them were based on what could we build fastest and biggest, no matter where the best location was.
And by 1960, people are recovered and they're starting to kind of look about and go, maybe there are some problems we need to address.
Growing up surrounded by urban sprawl, young Koppelman found inspiration in the works of one particular author.
Well, I was always interested in planning from the time of elementary school on. The big discovery was when I was 15. I was always a very intensive reader, and I discovered Lewis Mumford. Mumford was a brilliant writer. His prose was captivating, but he was also a very critical critic of how our communities were developing. And he had great insight in how planning could improve the life of people if it were done properly. And that's what I try to follow.
A planner balances social, economic, and environmental forces through the work, and it may include roads, bridges, transit links, affordable housing policy, coastal zone management policy. So what you really have to be when you're a planner is you have to be a master of all trades. You have to be a Renaissance man or woman. Koppelman stood up, and through his vision and his work, he kind of set the template for planning throughout the region.
After earning a degree in electrical engineering, Dr. Koppelman worked as a private planner and landscape architect in the Suffolk County region. But this would soon change. In the 1950s, a county executive with planning on the mind saw a visionary in Koppelman and knew what this man could achieve.
When I went into office, it was a reform type of government headed by a former county employee, H. Lee Dennison. And his entire campaign was based on planning.
Okay.
So I was captivated by that. I had no intention of going into government. I got a call from him, and I thought it was in response to the planning recommendations that I had made to the community. And I met him at his office in Port Jefferson Station, and we were talking past one another for the first few minutes, because I had a mental note. I was there to talk about my plan, but he had a different agenda. And not a man of great patience. The conversations were chilling. He slammed the table and he said, "Damn it, are you going to work for me or not?" So I was so taken with it, I called him up and I said, let's talk about the job.
During his time in office, Dr. Kaltman had the power to set the agenda that he and his hand-picked staff would follow. His character and authority created an office known for its professionalism as well as its efficiency.
I found Lee was always very intense and very serious, and I often wondered if he had a sense of humor. I've since learned that in fact he does, and I very much enjoy being around him and laughing. But he was a very serious businessman, and when you came to work, you were there to work, and he expected that you did your work, and you did a lot of it.
He wanted people to do the best jobs that they could on the various projects, but he also gave people the freedom to proceed with those projects and take the bull by the horns and more or less run with the project, and I think we all appreciated that. Everyone respected Lee Koppelman. Okay, he had the unique ability to turn his wrath on and off when the need arose. And you didn't want to be on the other side of that when it happened, I'll tell you that.
Well, when Lee tackled a problem, my impression is that he just really grabbed it and wouldn't let go of it until he came up with a rational solution to whatever he was dealing with.
In government, I figured Suffolk County was like this clear table that we were starting from ground zero because they never did any planning. Neither did most of the communities throughout the United States in those days. But in any event, that's how we started. And it was quite a challenge because I could pick what I wanted. And one of the first things I wanted was the segment of the plan dealing with open space and conservation, because the rate of development, Suffolk County was the fastest growing county in the entire United States.
Right.
And that's no small achievement when you consider there are over 3,060 counties. And Suffolk County was numero uno. And the problems were galore. Every problem of suburban development, suburban sprawl, the lack of environmental concern or legislation, it was all there to be done.
He also, related land use issues to the environmental questions that were important then and frankly are just as important today as they were then. Groundwater quality, surface water quality, open space protection, natural resource protection.
And that's what I initiated in the county.
You have to recognize by 1960, like 60% of Long Island was under the age of 21. So there's the need for schools, there's the need for more houses. People are pushing out from the city. We have the building of the Long Island Railroad, which starts right after World War II and continues right into the early 1970. So it's also bringing the east end of Long Island more into the kind of suburbs of New York City. So you have this massive population push that is going on. You have new groups that are coming in, so there's definitely some tensions that way. But it's all about building for home. This is about creating that perfect neighborhood.
The Suffolk County Plan presented in 1970 was an assessment of all these factors and a proposal of how to keep Long Island's economy, community, land, and water in balance. Throughout the enactment of his plans and continued research, Dr. Kaltman created and published some of his most influential reports that led to many of Suffolk County's most progressive policies, some of which were the first of their kind in the nation. One problem in particular would lead to the development of a program that would later be replicated across the United States.
Long Island is really kind of very limited, so we started building on more and more agricultural productive land. And so you start to get this kind of fight over farming property versus developed areas. And with the farming property, part of that isn't just about the need for farm goods, it's also about cultural and historic preservation. You have people going, this is my, my grandfather's land, my great-grandfather's land, going all the way back 6 generations, going, I don't want to give up this land.
So not only did he work to try to preserve farmland, but he also recognized that farmland was one way to also achieve more open space. So he worked very hard with the Suffolk County legislature and the county exec to try to set aside and preserve farmland so that Suffolk County would not become like Queens.
After much discussion with the farmers themselves, they came up with a plan to buy the development rights of the land, requiring that those living there only be able to use it for agricultural purposes. This would allow the farmers to keep their historic lands while protecting them from further development.
But since the first segment of the comprehensive plan was open space, that I adopted as my particular area of research. And I looked at every parcel of 100 acres or more throughout the entire county. So if I identified property that I felt had an environmental benefit, I would then contact the town and ask them to pursue it. And quite often we were getting inquiries of donation. A lot of citizens wanted to see their property preserved.
We have roughly 20,000 acres of farmland protected under this program that was the purchase of development rights and things. And 50, I don't know what the number is exactly, 60,000 acres of open space. And again, essentially people today can take advantage of what those actions back then have done for us today. So it's a major thing for Suffolk County.
It is something to keep in mind when we look at this kind of period from, shifting ideas from the 1950s going into the 1960s. 1960s, we see the beginning of what we call the rise in environmentalism. You have definitely a competition, though, between environmental concerns and economic concerns. And so we're starting to see kind of this conflict. And it's not always necessarily a conflict, but maybe a growing awareness of, we want this, but we also want this. How do we have it all?
The spread of this awareness would allow Dr. Koppelman to dive into an investigation encompassing both open space and water quality.
By the Long Island area-wide waste treatment management plan, the so-called 208 study. That involved Nassau and Suffolk counties, all the environmental agencies, the state of New York, the federal government, EPA, a massive study.
And that was the first of its kind that really looked at the linkage between land use and groundwater quality. And in this region, that's really critical because we have a sole source aquifer. But long story short, you dig long enough on Long Island, you hit groundwater. That's where we get our drinking water from. At the time, the federal government was a little more liberal with their expenditure of money in this area, so they gave localized grants to municipalities looking to study these things. Dr. Koppelman capitalized on it and launched the first study that showed this connection.
The 208 study was named after a section in the Federal Water Pollution and Control Act. This section outlined a program to encourage municipal engineering proposals involving sewers and water quality. During the height of the environmental movement in 1972, the act had just been amended to include planning in addition to engineering.
And the act was unique in the history of Congress in that it provided any agency that had an approved plan within the first year of the enactment of the act would receive 100% funding.
Wow.
So as soon as I saw that, I dropped everything and started preparing an application. We had created this committee to help me prepare the draft. So the first question they asked was, how much are we asking for? I said, don't ask that question. We're putting together an application. I want the application to be comprehensive. What, in your professional judgment, do we need to do to have a good, comprehensive working plan. So we started from that issue.
After a long-awaited approval, Koppelman and his colleagues were able to begin the study, but soon after he came to find out that they were the only ones to apply for the funds. While the original study was given a budget of around $5 million, he eventually received over $20 million for additional programs and reports requested by the government.
So not only have we tried to protect our water supply, but we have tried to protect the quality of that water supply. And Dr. Koppelman recognized that very early on. And one of the things that came out of his 208 study was that we needed to do appropriate zoning in order to make sure that we maintained that water supply.
The 208 study, after it was completed, actually had other studies piggyback off the work. You had the Special Groundwater Protections Area study that looked at areas of Long Island. So the 208 study looked at, okay, when it rains and there's a factory, that will influence recharge for the aquifer and groundwater quality. Special Groundwater Protection Area study said, okay, now that we know that, are there certain areas of Long Island that we should protect because they're geologically more sensitive than others? And that kind of, in 1992, set the precedent that the preservation of the Pine Barrens that made that possible.
The Pine Barrens is about 120,000 acres of virgin pine barren woodland. In these forests, rainfall is able to filter through sandy soils and regenerate the aquifer below, rather than turn into potentially contaminated runoff. Because of this process, the water in the aquifer is the cleanest on the island and can be used for the wells of homes and businesses. Additionally, the Barrens are known for their globally rare ecotype that includes a large number of endangered and threatened species.
And it's those studies that allowed that protection. And it really was possible because of Dr. Koppelman's work and the team he put together to study those issues.
The most significant thing that came out of it that we're still dealing with today was the identification of nutrients as a problem for our coastal waters. And so the 208 study really brought that to everybody's attention, and we began to develop research programs that addressed that.
Really, we're still working out the echoes of that study. We're discovering new contaminants every day. You have 1,4-dioxane, you have the firefighting foam additives that are now coming into the groundwater, and emerging contaminants, pharmaceuticals, everything like that, some nasty stuff. And really, it's all possible because of the 208 study.
But this is it. And the 10 boxes of reports that I have filed away are all referenced in here. So it was a fundamental look at how Suffolk County operated with respect to the influences on groundwater and surface water. He related the two. What happens in the water is due to what happens on the land and in the atmosphere. You can't cut them apart, and you got to look at the big picture. So, that kind of comprehensive look is now, it's more commonplace than it was back there. It was a different time.
Dr. Koppelman's focus wasn't only bound to the land. Both his personal interest and scientific background drew his focus to Long Island's renowned beaches and coastal waters.
One of the things to keep in mind is with the baby boom and this push towards what I often kind of term home and hearth, also included a push towards recreational time. And so people wanted to go out here on Long Island and go to the beaches and go out and boat. But in doing so, it also brought about awareness. So while they're using up, oil and gas on the boat, they also want to go out and see clean water. And they're starting to notice the water isn't as clean. They're going down to the beaches and going, we want to have these beautiful white sand beaches that Long Island becomes famous for. But look, there's garbage. One of the reasons people want to live on Long Island and want to visit Long Island is because of our natural environment.
The health of coastal waters, such as those in the Great South Bay, became a major concern during this time, which is when Koppelman had started studying the bay's 75 miles of coastline. Through these studies, Dr. Koppelman saw that he would have to take both the public's needs and their environmental concerns into account while conducting his research.
At the end of the year, we produced the report of the Oceanographic Committee. Now, when the committee started, it started with the idea in mind of maximizing the economic benefits of the coastal zone. And I wasn't interested in the deep ocean, but since we have in Nassau and Suffolk 90% of New York State's ocean frontage, the shoreline, the littoral edge, is very important. And I knew the processes of how sand transport supports the beaches of Long Island and the circulatory system of how it operates. So I had a pretty intimate knowledge of the general workings of it. And the committee started with the idea of what we could develop to exploit the economic benefits of the nearshore environment. Well, at the end of the year, by the time we were done, what started as an economic study was transformed completely into an environmental study.
Things were changing with respect to water quality. There was major interest in Long Island Sound with fish kills and deteriorating oxygen conditions, et cetera, et cetera. Water supply was always a question, groundwater supply and water quality there, but we had tremendous fisheries back then. The hard clam fishery was premier in the world. So there was a lot of good reasons to get involved in those sorts of things. And again, I think I might have mentioned this, but there were no national estuary programs in place back then. You know, we didn't have that focus. So that was a precursor to all those things developing.
So that was one factor that developed into it. But when we did the study, I realized there wasn't a single college or university in the entire United States that had any program dealing with the littoral environment. So one of the key policy recommendations in our report, I called upon Stony Brook University to create one. After all, you know, it was our institution. Well, my recommendation for this new marine research situation, I went to the academic vice president, Bentley Glass, who was a geneticist, a biologist. So I invited him to the regional board, and I made a brief presentation of the study of the Oceanographic Committee, which the board had already heard, but it was for Bentley Glass's impression. And I did it before the board because I wanted Bentley Glass to see Suffolk and Nassau's leading citizens to carry weight, so Bentley Glass knew it was more than just an adjunct professor at Stony Brook talking.
And there were some prominent scientists available and who participated in that committee. The deputy director, former deputy director of Brookhaven National Laboratory, for example, was the research administrator for that group. Admiral Stephan was first oceanographer of the U.S. Navy. And at the time, Marine Sciences was represented by Don Squires. And later on, Jerry Schubel was involved in it. So, there was that direct relationship between people who were typically associated with the planning process and the scientific community, the marine sciences community.
And that's how he created it. He called up and said, I'm willing to support the creation of this new center to get involved in marine affairs on the nearshore environment. He said, in exchange, however, you've got to get me someone to be dean of this new program. So when he called and said, you've got to furnish a man, the Admiral knew everybody was involved in the field. And that's how we got Don Squires, who had been involved in Chesapeake Bay as the first dean of Marine Science Research Center. And I was asked to join as an adjunct professor, so I was one of the first faculty. But they had people like Peter Weil, brilliant oceanographer. He would spin off ideas like a 4th of July sparkler. We were asked to prepare the curriculum, Peter Sandland and I, and sustainability was now the latest catchword in the planning field. So I worked on 2 of the curriculum, one on planning, one specifically on sustainability.
Koppelman was able to spread his knowledge to students in both the marine sciences and political science departments. The MSRC would eventually become part of a larger program, the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences, but even as the university evolved, Koppelman's abilities as a professor continued to impress his colleagues and have profound impacts on his students in both departments.
As a graduate student, graduate school at Stony Brook was an incredible experience, but learning from the person who shaped literally the roads you were driving on to access the university was something else. And what was interesting was, for the 3-hour class, he basically lectured the entire time.
When he taught in classes that I was teaching, he was a great lecturer. And one of the things that's always amazed me about Lee is that he could stand in front of an audience without notes, speak coherently for an hour and a half, and never break. And it was just absolutely fascinating that anybody could organize their thoughts so well and have them so well organized that they could just get them out there without even a pause or a break in their sentences.
Koppelman's use of his mind and capabilities also aided him throughout his many years in office when he communicated with the public sphere. Here, he would use his charisma and fact-based discussions to show the communities of Suffolk County how they were affecting their natural surroundings and resources.
He had the ability to utilize media at the time to advance the process of regional planning in Suffolk County. And when he did studies, reports, he would always manage to have press releases on those studies. And I think that was an important way to get the word out, because back then, as I mentioned, I think, to you in another setting, there were no emails, there was an internet. He had to do it via personal contact and presentations and getting written documents and reports out, which he presented. So it was sort of a different world. And newspapers were big back then, of course. They're perhaps less important today.
Issues like wastewater and zoning and form-based codes and third tracks on the railroad, these aren't fun topics. But if you can appeal to the better angels of your friends and neighbors and community members, the best way to do it is through a vehicle. And that vehicle happened to be Newsday.
And I had to look at the newspaper. This is a clip from Newsday, right? This is June 19th, 1973, about a year after Lee hired me. And this is a study. This picture is a North Shore Bluff erosion problem study, which I was involved in, one of Lee's studies.
It's just that, again, because he's a person with integrity, he did a good job for all those decades, and he put his message, because it has a sincere belief behind it, onto a platform where Long Islanders can read it. That's how you get the discussion started.
One of the things to keep in mind is we often use this term, the public. And in many ways, that's really a misnomer, because who exactly is the public? The public does include scientists, does include environmentalists, it includes farmers, it includes fishermen, it includes, the suburban housewife. And so we often term the public, and we have to think about that it's not a unified thought of what they want, what they need, and necessarily what they know.
And in all our environmental work, all our planning work, I counted on citizen participation. I never hand-pointed people to a citizens committee. They had to be volunteers. Anyone who would volunteer and be willing to serve, that was fine with me.
And when you involve the public, it involves learning how to talk to the public and being inclusive of diversity of thought, and it's a patience.
But if you have the patience and you have the facts, and you need both, and you can bring them along to understand that there are different alternatives they should consider, these citizens will change some long-held positions that they may have had, because they are interested, they are intelligent, they are concerned, and they are reasonable. But you have to make the case.
Right.
He had the data, he had the numbers, and he had the expertise to make the argument. So you have to kind of respect someone. He once told me he went into a meeting in Calverton. He was pushing for converting the old Grumman site where they built the jets and everything else into a freight airport, and the community was staunchly opposed to it. But he stated his case. It was a contentious hearing, and in the end, they respected him for it because he stated the case. And that's one of the most valuable lessons he taught was, if you have a belief, stick by it. Back it up again with that data.
Extremely lucid in his thinking. He is about one of the clearest thinkers that I've ever run across. And I think those were all things that aided him in his ability to be influential for such a long period of time and to have such sway over the political community in Suffolk County and Nassau County as well.
He had to tell people about it, but he had to tell them in terms that they could understand and understand its relevance to them. So he would take a technical study and would use presentation boards and get up there with a pointer and do that. And, you know, he was the expert planner.
He's not afraid to share his opinion, but you know that that opinion is backed by facts and logic. Again, the planner, master of all trades. You know that you're getting a nonpartisan, non-biased assessment. Sometimes it's blunt, but it's an accurate, honest depiction to the best of his knowledge. Plus, they were good ideas. They were motherhood issues, drinking water quality, protection of land and open space. These are critical elements to shaping a region sustainably.
He could get his ideas across to his employers, the political community, and the public as well. And that is a talent that not many of us have.
Kopman's influence can be found in the cleaner waters and many preserves on the island, a few of which have been named after him in recognition of his work and involvement with the public. Many today still look to Dr. Kopman for his wisdom and continue to use the foundations of his studies when trying to find solutions to the problems that are currently afflicting Suffolk County.
People often look at problems and are overwhelmed by them in the sense that it would take too much to do something. Right now we just can't do it all. That's probably true. But each individual step that you take toward some goal will actually contribute toward getting there. You know, perhaps when they first did a purchase of development rights on one farm, who would have known that now you got 20,000 acres preserved? You got to start someplace and you got to do it. So I think that you know, the ability to focus on some end objective and working toward it, and essentially devoting decades, because that's how long things take to accomplish in many instances. So I think that you know, people shouldn't forget that. And I think you know, how many students has Lee mentored over the years? He's been there for how many years? 50? Maybe more? Maybe that's his legacy.